Tom Jaszczak received his BA in Visual Art and his BS in Biology from Bemidji State University. He was an honored maker at the White House and a long-term resident at the Archie Bray Foundation. Recently, Tom began a 3-year residency with his wife, Maggie Finlayson, at Penland School of Crafts. Please welcome Tom.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to run through a few thank yous. I want to thank my high school teacher, John Holtz, my college teacher, Butch Holden, Simon Levin, Tara Wilson, the Archie Bray Foundation and Steve Lee, and the Penland School of Crafts, and of course, Nsika for having me up here. Where's the remote? All right. I grew up in Minnesota and had a very stereotypical Minnesota childhood. Sledding, eating Minnesota cuisines like hot dish, lutefisk, ice fishing, playing pond hockey, hating the Green Bay Packers, and listening to my grandfather use things like, "Oh yeah, you betcha," and "pert near." Starting at an early age, I would help my grandpa pick fruits and vegetables from his endlessly large garden. This garden would feed our large family of over 40 people. It was so powerful to see what he could produce. So when I was 8 years old, I started my own garden. It was a success, and my dad was so good at making me feel like whatever I grew was so important. He treated all of our childhood creations this way. We all developed our own passions through his enthusiasm. My dad himself is often creating in the garage, whether it's a tune on his harmonica or shoes to walk on water for duck hunting. I was lucky enough to attend a high school that offered several electives and took field trips to places like the Northern Clay Center. I remember gathering what little cash I had to buy my first pot there, a Sarah Jagger mug. These years were formative. It allowed students to develop passions in things like the arts. The masterpiece you see here is one of the first pots I made in high school. I titled it the Cloud Bowl. It is now in the private collection of Paul and Lucy Jaszczak. In college, I enrolled in ceramics, looking for that same elective experience I had in high school. Butch Holden, the ceramics teacher, had a great sense of adventure, bringing his free spirit to class each day. We could essentially do whatever we wanted in the studio. He would encourage it. Butch and us students would organize small adventures to the American Pottery Festival in Nsika or camp out while we embarked on the great St. Croix Pottery Tour. Butch would say inspiring things like, "Don't let school get in the way of your education," or "skip class," essentially. The pottery tour became a model of a lifestyle I could see. My grandpa's garden, married with a life of passion making pots. After 4 years of taking ceramics as an elective, it had become an elective no longer. I had a degree in biology and an addiction to clay, so I stayed in school for another year and got my art degree. After college, I moved away and continued to make pots. After a few years, I moved back to Minnesota, and reconnecting with the pots and the people there became so important. I realized that what those pots meant to me, and I saw them a little differently. I knew more about pots and could see they were not just the local pots I admired, but that these pots had a special part of history. For me, they were not overthought. They had life in them. They were honest. They showed the clay in some way, and had a handmade energy to them, each their own but similar too. As I began to understand my personal direction my work was going, I realized I needed to change the wood-fired surface of my work. I was very lucky for a few things to fall into place. I received 2 grants to research soda-firing earthenware. This idea was a result of a failed wood firing and seeing the beauty of these under-fired pots, seeing a low-temperature ewer that was made by Bede Clark, and visiting Matt Kelleher's studio while he was at the beginning stages of switching to Cone 3 soda himself. Initially, I wanted to see what earthenware could look like when you brought it to the edge of failing. Experimentation has always been a driving force in my studio practice, and this seemed like uncharted waters. The final piece of the puzzle was a phone call from Steve Lee at the Archie Bray Foundation. I had impressed Steve by successfully being hungover for a week straight while mowing the lawn in preparation for the Bray's 60th anniversary. He asked me to fill in a vacant spot in the summer studio, and 2 days later, I was a resident at the beloved Archie Bray. This marriage of money, time, and facility was such an unwarranted gift, and it changed so many things in my work. What Steve didn't know is that I would stay for an additional 51 more months. Eventually, the Bray found it best to pay me for my labor, and in exchange, I showed up to work sober. As I began my research and unloaded several kiln loads into the dumpster, I spent my first summer at the Bray testing slips and glazes that would work at this temperature while withstanding the violent atmosphere. Glazes turned out to be more problematic, so I started making pots that didn't need a liner glaze and moved things forward from there. At first, I was really making the same wood fire pots and firing the Minnesota kiln. I was seduced by the drama and the range of color. I think I skipped. The results can be spectacular at this temperature, and we're so short in time. Hold on. I skipped the slide. Oops. All right. Around this same time, things were moving forward in the studio. My parents came to visit me at the Bray. As we were touring, my dad, a trained bricklayer and storyteller extraordinaire, bumped into some graduate students doing research on the old brickyard. He turned a 5-minute tour stop at the beehive kilns into a 2-hour discussion of brick and its history. Part of the tour the researchers gave was a timeline of all the brick forming techniques, with the actual bricks formed. The first ones were crudely made, press-molded bricks with beautiful drag marks. These drag marks got me thinking, as I had been scraping planes into my work for some time. So I began adding 10-mesh grog into my clay and making a sort of pseudo-brick clay. This really accented all the scraping on my pots and added these dramatic pits and drag marks, giving the work a very physical layer that combined with the fluid and soft layer of the slip, which gave a simple kind of depth. It was my way of showing the clay. One of the main reasons I decided to make a surface change was to incorporate some decorative elements on the pots. I knew I didn't want to use imagery, but wanted my pots to have another layer. This idea led me back to the Minnesota pots I adore. Around this time, I had grown even more fond of Michael Simon's work and Mark Ferris's work. My slipware had taken on a similar look as Michael's work, and my shapes had migrated towards the planes and angular volumes of Mark's work. In school, I had always overlooked Mark's work, and now have grown so fond of it. His color blocking really became a model of the aesthetic I wanted in my own work, as well as the material surfaces. I also knew I wanted my decoration to be minimal. It's always been in my nature to pare things down to the essentials. A field trip we would often take in grade school was to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. The Modigliani paintings there were often the first to strike a chord with all students, thinking we could make something better. For me, they became a gateway to thinking minimally. I used this and color theory to develop some simple parameters, much like the formal parameters of a functional pot. I wanted to figure out how to incorporate shapes of color while limiting my choices to primary or neutral colors. The next step was to try and figure out a technique that would meld the decoration designs with the pot designs. I went through lots of techniques, layering slips, using wax, and played with post-fire overglaze. Eventually, I would figure out a tape resist technique that I could block in shapes of color. I also found out that because of my lower temperature, I could use almost any underglaze and it would maintain its vibrant color. The tape resist technique allowed me to also frame in the color with black. Much like the Modigliani paintings, this simple outline would push the color into the foreground of the pots, creating a third and final layer, and I quickly fell in love with the Modigliani-inspired primary colors and the way I could place tape on a pot. For me, decorating and glazing pots was always torture. This fit my personality and the rhythm of my studio practice. As the decorating quickly evolved, so did my influences. The decoration swayed towards graphics, and I intuitively began to think more about the graphics that surrounded us on a daily basis. and how they were placed. I started to manipulate the same feeling on the pots, bending lines and graphics on different parts of a pot. I began using the black outlines to enhance graphics and experimented with different sizes, shapes, and color schemes, and changing the rhythms of the decoration. This technique opened the door to so many new designs that I could never do with a brush. This really set up a new way to play with my pots in the bisqueware stage. This new playful tape resist and the continued use of primary colors cut into simple shapes also got me thinking about children's toys. Marrying these early memories of toys with the new decorating made a new playful narrative in the work. I wanted my work to explore the phenomenon of simple human curiosity, expanding the feeling of a lid being placed in a jar, much like a square block fitting into a square hole. I've used this decoration to match a lid on a jar, and maybe more uniquely, a cup to its saucer. This has a way of bringing out different personalities in people, like if you are OCD and have to match the shapes up together every time, or if you are the person who is enamored with the shapes randomly meeting, or how a set of pots gets stacked up in the cupboard. Maybe you are a real freak and arrange them by color, like the person who eats their M&Ms by color. It creates a small sense of discovery and control. It can create a simple narrative for nesting bowls. Whether the bowls are stacked or unstacked, this simple set of parameters has generated a new twist for me to think about my work. It has come full circle and led me to think more about adding some playful elements to the actual utility side of pots. First, I began with the simple addition of hand-carved spoons. This seemed to have a nice unity. Hand-carving spoons is a reductive process, and my pots are made in a very reductive manner, carved and scraped. Wood also has a soft sheen, much like the finish of my sodium glazed pots. For me, these pots are about expanding the excitement I buy when I buy a new Linda Christensen mug. You might plan several celebratory meals around a small pot like this, looking up a new curry recipe. The use of wood in this kind of narration led me to think about how a pot can be installed while it's not in use. There's a kind of story that can be told in this simulation. Favorites get plucked down first, maybe chipped, while the wire and nails slowly rust over time and all these materials gather their similar but different patinas. Glass has become another source of inspiration. The shapes and proportions of various bottles lined up like soldiers at a bar is both inspiring and seductive, much like a wearboard of freshly made pots. I also find glass intriguing because of its similar planes and shapes of my work, its stable posture, and its inherent cold feeling. Glass and clay have so much in common between their usefulness and how they are made. But as materials are opposites, glass is cold and hides the human touch. Clay is often warm in nature and embraces the touch. This set of liquor bottles is an example of how I can use various shapes to make a similar narrative and use my decoration to create a parallel to the labeling or branding of the bottles. As I was finishing up my time at the Bray, I had been thinking about the evolution of all these layers of materials and processes. I wanted to continue to push this narrative in the work. Maggie and I forced ourselves to take the rare day off from the studio and went to Butte to a local distillery. As we drank a few cocktails and admired the overall process, the distillery told this great handmade story that was easy for a potter to admire. So I made a cocktail set, using the elements of my work, which included a hand-carved stir stick, cocktail cups, bitter bottles, liquor bottles, and funnels, all on a maple shelf, sort of like a Big Mac. This piece was my way to celebrate a cocktail after a long day. That led me to make this breakfast set to celebrate a morning ritual. This set is comprised of a creamer, sugar jar, hand-carved spoon, honey jar, honey dipper, and 2 porridge bowls. The last piece of this series is a serving set. I wanted to make a piece that showed the scope of my work and made me the centerpiece of a meal without having to actually be there for the embarrassment. Finally, as I reflect on my work, I realized that this recent work might appear as an intense investigation into a pot's function. This is not what motivates me. I don't make pots to change people's lives or any other romantic notions. I make pots for selfish reasons. I enjoy the problem solving that is involved in these processes and narratives. As the late Lucy Rhee said, they're just pots. And for me, they're a kind of homage to the pots and potters of Minnesota I adore, the simple lives of my grandparents, and the childish joy my dad finds inventing in the garage. Thank you.